Greetings, welcome to Powered by Nyame. I'm your guide and host, Kwesi Kunadu. On this episode, we're going to focus on the problem with African religions or spiritualities. Yes, I said problems. Now, let me outline what I think is some of the main problems, but the central problem with African religions, in quotation, or African spiritualities as you and I may prefer. In either case, let me lay out the case for these problems. Now, it's a problem that all religions have. The first problem is that all religions or spiritualities or belief systems, they are particular. They are specific to a culture, a group of people, which means that the specificity that a group has and their belief of that group makes them a particular kind. The idea here is that no religion or spirituality is universal. And because they're not universal or semi-universal, then they face the same problem of being peculiar, of being particular, of being specific, of being of a particular culture, right? Now, some of you may say, well, what about these so-called world religions? Islam, Christianity, Judaism? Well, those are specific religions or beliefs that have been transmitted throughout the world, usually through colonization, conquest, and the like. And so they still are specific, just that they have been more traveled because of the kinds of colonial empire that brought them to much of the world. But they come from specific origins, right? So even they too are specific. So, for instance, Catholicism is a traditional religion of certain parts of Europe, particularly Southern Europe, whereas northern parts of Europe, for example, what is now Russia, you have an Orthodox form of Christianity that reigns there and has reigned there for centuries, and so you have diversities and therefore specific kinds. Now, what the problem is this: is that each specific culture has a conception of a supreme being, of a deity, of a creative force. Not all, but many do. So take, for example, in Japan, in the indigenous religion of Japan, referred to as Shintoism, there is no creative force or supreme being in terms of their conception. It's simply what a range of spiritual entities and forces that have a part to play in human life, right? And in much of the world, you'll find that, right? So, for instance, in the Americas, you have many of the so-called indigenous and therefore, Aborigines people of the Americas, South America, Central America, and the Caribbean Basin, as well as North America and Canada. They have this notion of a great spirit, right? Right, but they also have different entities that animate their physical and spiritual world. Likewise, among the Aborigines in Australia, they have a conception of a main or primordial divinity referred to as Bayama or Bayami, depending upon the pronunciation. But even then, there's a host of spirit entities that animate their particular world. And so across the world, Africa no less, you have these specific cultural references to these forces. Now, the problem is that none of these individual specific forces, whether they be Nyame or Odumankoma or Chidiampong among the Akan, or maybe Oludumare among the or Alokum among the Yoruba, or they may be Mawu or Mawulisa among the Ewefon or Fombe, or they may be other kinds of creative forces. They're all specific to a cultural group or a cultural group of people, but they are not essentially the universal or cosmic force that is over all of these. And this is the idea that I want to get to, that is a problem, because oftentimes specific cultures, they have a particular reference, but that reference, of course, is under a larger entity, right? And so in a moment, this would all make much sense. The second problem is that the problem of African spirituality is the problem that the world that is unseen, the other dimensions, is not one that is easily grasped in terms of the different kinds of spiritual entities and forces that exist. There are ancestral spirits, there are negative spirits or demonic spirits, there are spirits of great character and that is of God. And even then there are different hierarchies and steps and levels, so many multiples, right? That we humans can't grasp the complexity of these levels and the host of entities that exist at those levels. And so that world is not a world that is simply a matter of ancestors, spiritual forces, and a creative force. It's much more broader, much more wider, much more complex than that. Therefore, when people within indigenous Africa-based spiritualities, both in Africa and the Americas, refer to, these host of entities, there are bigger and greater forces that exist, and a wide range of them, right? In addition to those specific ones that are found in those cultures. So among, for example, Yoruba, one can refer to Shango, or they can refer to Yemanya, or they can refer to Ogun, and the whole, host in that so-called pantheon. Say among the Akan, you can refer to the different Abusum or spiritual forces that are there. Tunnel ones, you can refer to, range of the Ntoa ones, you can refer to the Bosumrafo, the ones that usually come from the northern part of Ghana. Whole range of forces, but those are not representative of the entire cosmos. They're simply a fraction of it. And that problem here is that that fraction doesn't really allow the practitioners to grasp the complexity within the cosmos, because they're basically stuck in the box of that particular cosmology as represented by that cultural group. In other words, think of it as you are a nurse or a doctor or a carpenter, but you only liaison or network with doctors or carpenter nurses at your hospital or at your particular place of work, not others, within the world, outside of your neighborhood, outside of your city. And so, yes, you're a member of that group, but there's a whole world of people or beings, in this case, like you, that are not in that particular area, right? And so that's the second problem, is specificity. It's sort of the box within which they fit. And the third problem that confronts African spiritualities is that the ways in which I've laid out in other videos about the problem of studying African religion and spiritualities and how to fix it. The problem that is the third one in this video is that African spiritualities, they are located, right, within languages and within ecologies, that are not universal and can't be universalized, right, because of the sheer, breadth and diversity of the African continent, and because of the breadth and sheer historical experiences of the people of the African continent, both within the outlying islands as well. And so the diversity heightens the level of complexity, which doesn't allow for one particular kind of group to dominate, to become universalized, and therefore to become sort of a main reference point. And so therefore it is the languages and the belief system are sort of stuck in specificity, if that makes sense, right? And so those three problems, I want to make it more personal to you. Those three problems, I went through, particularly in the last year and a half or 2 years. At one point, I was being led by, let me back up a moment. I have two main groups in terms of sort of ancestral forces that are linked to, again, that network and levels and layers of spiritual entities. And so primarily, I have Akan, but also Fombe in the human sense of culture. In a spiritual sense, these, of course, is a large range of forces. Nonetheless, I had been driven or led by a group of my folks, right, ancestral and otherwise, that are from the Fombe side, that are from the Akan side. And they were leading me and I was following. And in following, they were leading me down a path that would end to my own destruction. And I didn't realize that because I was too busy being blinded by the idea that this is African spirituality, these are my people, these are my ancestors, these are spiritual forces that are tied to my ancestors, so why wouldn't I follow them? Why wouldn't I listen to them? And I know many of you who follow this channel or check it out, are really in tune with, and there's no problem being in tune with your ancestry and want to connect with your ancestors. But what I'm about to share with you may, make you can reconsider or think about that in a different way. And so I was being led and driven by these people that are leading to my own destruction. Destruction of what? Of my soul. I was this close to being a lost soul. This close, right? And all along, I'm doing all the rituals, as some of you know, and I remind those of you that don't know, I was so-called trained as a Busumfu in Techiman in Ghana for about 7 years. I had two main particular Abusum, my main one being Takofi, located at a village called Takofiano in Techiman. And this is a Tano Busum that's the home to the most sacred river in Ghana, referred to as the Tano River. So the Tano River was the locus or the location where this particular spiritual force calls its physical or material home. And so I'm doing all the rituals, all the libations, all the sacrifices, I'm doing healing work, but I'm also being driven by, again, these people that are pushing me in a certain direction. And I'm following them. And my epiphany, my moment of realization, which is what I'm sharing with you, and you may have one as well, is that, at one point, I began to, get communications, right? From the God of all gods, right, himself. And this is what I refer to as Father God, because he's like a father to me, usually very gentle, very straightforward, very direct. And I've not only seen him in my dreams, my own eyes, but also in person. Right? And you may wonder how, but that's another time. The point I'm making is that, I began to be interested and to inquire. I began to be, intrigued, by, this great spirit, as indigenous people over the world, refer to what I'm referring to as Father God. And so this force, the more I began to communicate with, the more I began to see, the wonders and see, the work and the, the energy and the kindness, and the love, of this God. And he came to me once and told me, I am the God of all God, meaning I am the force, the greater force of all spiritual forces. I am the God of all gods, the principal divinity of all divinities, right? And it wasn't said with any arrogance, it was just a matter of fact, and I could feel that. And in feeling that, as I began to move closer, to this God of all gods, referred to as Father God, right? I also began to hear the people that were leading me, the beings, the entities that were leading me, to my path of destruction, scream out, no! And when it happened, that was the key moment for me, right? This was sometime, I think, early last year. That was key. And the more I therefore began to draw myself closer to Father God, the more I began to, hear and follow less of those people that lead into my destruction, right? I was this close to being written off as a lost soul. Now, what does that mean? That means this. It means that there are three kinds of people, as far as I'm aware, and I could be wrong, but I think I'm generally correct here. There are three kinds of people in this human world. There are those whose souls are pure, are solid as gold, and these are people that were like, the elders in your community, if you grew up with one, or those with generation or two past, that would always, be caring, be careful, and also very, loving of their own children and others, of other people that are not related to them. And they would look out for and be there for as a benefactor for the entire community. Those are the souls I'm referring to. Then you have the second kind of people, right? These are the people that are the lost souls. These are people that, used to have a soul but no longer have a soul. So they have a body, they have a mind, and they exist just like you and me around. They go shopping, they go partying, they go to the clubs, they go to the mall, they go to the movies, they go on planes. They do all the things you do, but inside it, you can't see with your own eyes. Inside, sometimes you can feel it. They're empty. There's no soul there, right? And so this is the second category. The third category, of people, these are just people who are not people at all. Yes, they may look like human beings, but these are negative spirits or demonic forces that simply live, through the guise of a human body. And they too have no soul. However, both the demonic person and the lost soul can still have an opportunity to gain grace among Father God, right? And so this is very important, right? The idea of redemption, even if one is lost. Now, they have to work much harder for it, but it is possible. Now, with these three kinds of people in mind, then we can go back to, the specificity of culture and belief, right? And so the three kinds of people were the three kinds of people that were actually leading me astray, right? So here I am with a good heart and a good soul, be led astray by those people because I simply assumed at face value, like many of us assume, that because, African ancestors are important, because African ancestry is key, then I just simply connect with, believe, and follow. And that's what I was doing in part. Because African, divinities or spiritual forces are African, I'm going to follow that because I want nothing to do with the white man's religion, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You've heard the rhetoric, right? But that was a trap, right? And this is what I'm saying is big part of the problem of African spirituality religions, right? Because many of us don't have the discernment to detect whom is who among this vast, complex array of hundreds of thousands of millions of different spiritual beings and forces that exist in this world. We don't have the capacity to determine which is which and who is who. Even the best of us, who are spiritual, sometimes gets fooled and tricked because, these forces can disguise themselves as something and something that you trust, right? And so even the best among us, can be had, by these forces. And that's how insidious and devious that they are. And I was this close to being amongst them. And once you become a lost soul, right, then you become recruited by, the forces of evil and wickedness and so on. You become a recruit because now you have literally nothing to lose, pun intended, because you've lost the most important thing, right? But again, there's a way in which to find yourself back, which is that you got to work hard at not only finding love, but giving the love you have and building it and keep building it. And of course, God only asks us of one thing, your love. That is your heart and your soul, right? Father God doesn't ask for money, cars, houses, gold, none of that. And so the way to get back to, to being in grace is in fact to give your heart, right? And you give your heart, that is, you give in your soul, that's all, right? And in return, right, you get to live, in the ways in which, many of our ancient ancestors live. You live in eternity because among Africans, of an older generations, they had a particular cosmology, a particular belief, which is true, is that you don't die, right, unless you're forgotten. And so the idea is that you live in perpetuity, but you can only live in perpetuity if your soul is right and your soul is with the right place and soul is in the right hands. That's how you do it, right? And so in the next video, I'm going to share with you some practical ways for those of you that feel lost, for those of you that feel confused, for those that feel that you're not where you should be in your life, those of you that feel that, you're married to someone, but you're not really married to them, those of you that feel like, you need to go elsewhere outside the marriage to find fulfillment and pleasure, that you feel like, your children are not living up to expectations, that you feel like your family is simply just a pretense, it's a fraud, it's a mirage. You're just keeping it together because, you think you can't do any better, or the mirage is worth, holding up until it doesn't hold up anymore. If you feel any of these, I can show you the way. Until next time, please drop your questions and comments in the section below. Until then, stay well.